This chapter is about the idea of race, and we are going to call structural racism. In chapter 3, we talked about human biological variation and all the ways that humans are varied biologically, and that those variations do not group very well under these broad categories that we have inherited called race. The way in which we classify people by race does not say very much about their biological variation. This chapter reiterates the findings of chapter 3. We're not going to go through all of those variations again, although we'll hit a couple of them just to refresh our memories. But the point is that race is a system of belief, a social system or an ideas that we have. It is not something that is scientifically correct as a way that tells us anything important about human biological variation. Now, let me be clear. Humans do have biological variation, and surprise, they do have different skin colors and body features. However, those features do not meaningfully group together in something that we can call race, which then tells us something else about the person. Like even whether they are lactose tolerant or not, even biological characteristics don't group together under these headings that we would call race. So that is a very important point. There's an accompanying point that is equally, if not more important, and it has to do with the idea of structural racism. Now, we have probably heard the term racism before, used a lot. But when we use the term racism in our everyday lives, we're usually thinking about mean things that people do to each other, or about ideas that people have about people from another race or ethnicity. We usually accuse people, perhaps, of being racist, of having bad ideas or bad words in their head. Structural racism is a little bit different. What it refers to is how our institutions, our schools, our systems of health, policing, geography, all shaped or have been shaped by this idea of race. What structural racism refers to is a systematic institutionalization of these racist ideas, so that it doesn't matter so much if you are living in a structurally racist society. It doesn't matter so much what your individual ideas are. You are going to be affected by that society more than anything you individually do. Other countries can have structurally racist societies, but we're mostly going to be talking about our society. Now, the point is that when we talk about race and racism, we can understand that it's bad to be racist and say individual things about other people. And I can understand that race is also just a belief system. It is not biologically valid. However, that does not make the structural racism go away. That is to say, we are hopefully going to be learning about the invalidity or the incorrectness of racial ideas. But just because I'm a nice guy and I don't think racist things doesn't mean that I don't still live in a society that has been structured by race. So, for example, if I go to the hospital and I get treated in a certain way based on stereotypes about who I am and what levels of pain I can tolerate, then I have experienced structural racism, whether or not I or even the people who are doing the treatments are actively individually racist. So, in this class, we're not throwing accusations at any individuals or any societies. We're simply trying to describe the structures in which these societies have been constructed. Asian societies certainly also have imported some of these ideas about race. And there are many societies in which people are excluded based on their ethnicity or race. This happens around the world, not just in the Americas. But the Americas is probably one of the places where, at least in our contemporary world, we developed these notions of black, white, Asian to begin with. So, back in chapter 3, we talked about skin color distribution at a time when people were not moving, for the most part, transoceanically. So, this would be a map which shows how skin color was gradually distributed over certain areas. If you took a walk from the northern part of Europe all the way down here, you would find gradual variation all along that path. You would not find a place where you crossed a river or a mountain and you said, I have now crossed from the land of the white people into the land of the black people. Because skin color variation is perfectly clinal or gradual. You can line everybody up, and there's a perfect continuum of skin colors. The lines we draw are based on approximations and categories that we put people into. The same thing applies to this walk from west to east. Even if you walk this way today, you will see a gradual variation in what are typified as European features, gradually going over into what might typify as Asian features. And all these populations in the middle, which have some mix of both, and individual variation within all of these populations. So, geographically speaking and clinally speaking, human variation does not coalesce into the things that we call races. We just watched the film Unca's Big Mucka, which talks about this part of the world. And if you looked at Unca and his population of people, and you brought them to the United States, we would probably classify those people in our system as black. You'd probably think African American even. But here they are all the way over in Papua New Guinea. Lots of evolutionary distance there, although we're all one interbreeding human species. The point of the matter is that there's a lot of skin color variation throughout the world that doesn't really fit our system of classification. And that is in part because our system of classification comes to us from the last 500 years of colonialism, in which certain populations moved transoceanically across the ocean and moved together and brought people from different parts of the world and put them together in places that were new to all of them. If you were to walk this gradually, you would see a gradual variation. But as people started to be moved around, some of them forcefully, and then made to labor on plantations in the Americas, they were grouped together in ways that they might not have been grouped before. And people started to talk about these things as an issue of racial classification. Colonialism is what takes these clinal variations and turns them into these block categories that we call race. It's not to say that before this, people didn't look at each other and talk about physical difference. Of course they did. But they did not group people into the same kinds of categories that we use today. You will notice that this is in some ways why our categories in the United States are in some ways, a very poor sample of the rest of the world. And when we encounter people from other parts of the world in the United States, we sometimes have difficulties because they don't fit into our traditional race classification systems. I mentioned people from Papua New Guinea. What race are you going to call them? In the United States, we don't know. In a similar way, we have perhaps now developed a racial category for people from South Asia, India, but the physical variation of people in India is quite enormous, ranging from very light skin to very dark skin, all kinds of things that we really don't know what to do with. They lump it together and we do all kinds of weird things with it because it doesn't fit into the early systems or the early so-called science of race. I put science in quotes here because this is not science, but people were trying to classify different people into groups. One of the first people who categorized human types in this way, our good friend Linnaeus, who gives us the genus species classification system that we use today, also tried his hand at categorizing human types. He would say that he divided them up into 4 blocks of people, maybe 6. And he talked about them as, and he would talk about their skin color and a few other physical traits and then give them characteristics too, like lazy. So whole groups of people were then supposedly classified by this, what we call a typology. So a typology is when you take a group or you take a subset or a sample and you group them together. You say all of these people are of a certain type. These are the dark-skinned people. These are the light-skinned people. And those people have certain characteristics. White people are lazy. That is combined with what is called essentialism, where you take that type and you link it to some other characteristic, and you say that this characteristic is something that all of these people share. It's not going to change because it's biologically given in their makeup or their characteristics. Can't change. At the time, when Linnaeus was categorizing human types, what he believed is that the species couldn't change. Elephants were essentially elephants. They'd been created by God as elephants, and that's the way they were. They weren't going to change because God had created the perfect elephant. And the same thing with these races. Blumenbach, not too many years later, is the one who gave us the term Caucasian. Some people, instead of calling themselves white, like to say that they are Caucasian. It always makes me laugh. It sounds scientific, or Caucasian, but it's one of the least scientific things you could say. I want to emphasize that both of these people were creationists. They both believed that they were describing God's creation. They were both describing things that were pre-Darwinian. This is before Darwin was even around at all. They believed that what they were describing in the natural world, both with plants, animals, and types of human beings, had been created by God, was not changed since the creation of about 6,000 years ago, and would not be changing anytime soon. Blumenbach believed, and probably Linnaeus too, that the races of the world were found around the place where Noah's Ark would have been, and that people were falling from that original ideal. He didn't believe in evolution, he believed people were getting worse. In his racial schema, the other races, other than the Caucasians, were even more degrading because they had been perfect. Humans were getting worse and worse. So it was in some ways the opposite of what most people believe about evolution. Caucasian. How did he get this word Caucasian from? Here's his skulls. So he was a person who was looking at different skulls in the world. This is in your textbook. And he decided that a particular skull that had been found in the Caucasus Mountains was a very beautiful example of human beings. And it was a female skull that had been found in the mountains of Georgia. Georgia, the country way over there. The term Caucasian is based on this area of the world, the Caucasus Mountains, where Blumenthal believed he had found the most beautiful people who also happened to be close to where Noah's Ark would have been. So that would have been those great Caucasians. So if you want to use the term Caucasian to describe yourself, go for it. But the true Caucasians are the people who live in this area of the world, which is now a very multi-ethnic place to be. Definitely a lot different than what most people believe as Caucasian. So I would say that if you, in the census, as we'll talk about, if you classify as white, just go for it. Caucasian is just a funny word to describe what Blumenthal thought. And again, very non-scientific, based on mythology. So Darwin comes along, and evolution and Darwinian thinking. And if you remember from Darwin, or biology, evolution, natural selection, depends upon the fact that there is diversity or variation in a population. If a population isn't diverse, you can't get evolution. There's nothing to work on. Why would things change? Darwin's diversity or Darwin's ideas depend upon how people are varied in each generation. All organisms, we're not perfect copies of the parents. And even if things are cloned, they're still going to have a different life cycle, different mutations, all kinds of things. In Darwin's view, all species are changing or evolving, changing over time, every generation and within that generation based on the different genetics, environmental characteristics. In a Darwinian view, and this is what is so different than Linnaeus and Blumenthal, a species doesn't have a fixed essence. The elephants of today weren't always the way they look. They've been changing. They've been branching out, maybe separating into different species. Once we had mammoths, different kinds of elephants, all kinds of things going on. There is no fixed essence to species. So although we might try to temporarily group creatures together in a typology, they're always going to be changing. There is no fixed essence to species. So if you took Darwinian evolutionary ideas seriously, that the typologies that we have are just simply descriptors of the world, and that a species is constantly changing, that there is no fixed essence, what should that have done to the idea of race? If a species, if elephants, penguins, gorillas, always changing, and there is no fixed essence to a species, what should that have done to people's ideas about race? We all agree that we are one interbreeding human species. So race is at most a subgroup within a species. So if you took Darwinian thinking correctly, it should have demolished this idea that there was a race group that made any sense, and that white people were eternally lazy, and that there were any traits that went with them for all time. This is what should have happened if people took Darwin correctly. Get into what happened. Let me give you an example of that has nothing to do with skin color or white people being lazy. Shovel-shaped incisors. Your book has this example. The inside of your teeth are biologically variable. It is genetically determined. You can probably modify them if you really care about it. You've probably never looked at these yourself. Perhaps your dentist knows whether you have shovel-shaped incisors or not. You do not care about this. It has no biological advantage or disadvantage. It is just something that shows up in human populations. And you can group people together by whether they have shovel-shaped incisors or not. If I really got it into my heads, I could tell you that we need to go look at all your teeth and we'd start grouping you together. What groups would we get? Well, interestingly, these do group up in different ways. So there are some populations that have a very large percentage of people with shovel-shaped incisors. Central Asia, Southeastern Asia, Melanesia, Australia. Lots of people in those areas. Others, not so much. But here's the deal. There is no population in which you could say everybody has shovel-shaped incisors, and there's no population in which you could say nobody does. And there's going to be a range of variation within that population, a percentage of how many people have them. And that percentage is always going to be changing over time. If we think about it, all of these traits which we think are fixed in nature and may belong to a particular group are not. They are changing. They might group up in certain areas over time, and certain percentages have those groups, have those shovel-shaped incisors or curly hair, freckles. All kinds of things can group up in certain areas, but that doesn't mean that every time you see somebody has freckles more than other people, but it's not going to define that whole population. Lactose tolerance is variable. It's not going to stick with one group or another. The ideas of Darwin should have demolished the ideas of race. It didn't go that way. For anybody who knows history, we got something very different out of the people who started using Darwin in a way that he probably should have disagreed with more strongly, but he himself didn't. In his original Origin of Species, Darwin did not use the term survival of the fittest. He talked about descent with modification. He was reluctant at first to talk about human evolution, and he was reluctant to talk about fitness. But the sociologist Herbert Spencer wrote him and he said, hey, this corresponds to this idea I have about survival of the fittest. This does not correspond to what evolution does because fitness is, for one thing, an evolutionary term that simply means people who have more offspring than others. And also, the environment is always changing. So, what is fit in one environment is not necessarily going to be fit in another environment. But Darwin borrows this term or uses it, and it's become very associated with evolution. It was later taken up by what we call the eugenics movement, who saw it as their duty to say, well, if evolution proceeds by breeding, by reproduction, how about we breed out the less fit people? How about we make sure we don't have any criminals? We'll just sterilize the parents of criminals. Yes, it leads to Nazi Germany. It does a number of things. First of all, it was used to justify anti-immigration laws to cut off populations from each other, saying that certain populations shouldn't be able to come because they were unfit. Some people still use this language today. One of them may be our current president. Eugenics is not a science. It is a pseudoscience. It is sometimes called scientific racism. I don't like to use the term scientific racism because it implies there is something scientific to racism. It was indeed used by the Germans and Hitler and the Nazis. Hitler himself said that what he was doing was borrowing the ideas of the scientists who lived in the United States and the United Kingdom. And he wanted to copy the ideas of of segregation and the laws that we had in the United States. That was really the basis for some of these ideas. I don't want to give this a lot of real estate here, but these were the kinds of posters you might see, or the kinds of advertisements in a eugenics society. So again, it led to some very bad things, forced sterilizations. If people wonder sometimes why, being African American, you might be suspicious of the health system, it is often because your own body was used for these kinds of experiments and sterilizations and other bad things. Fortunately, not all anthropologists were on board with this. Some were, but other people started to challenge this. In this time, a lot of people were using calipers to try and measure people's heads. They talked about things like the cephalic index. You try to look at somebody from above and determine how long their head was as compared to how broad it was, and that was supposed to be a measure of intelligence and IQ. Some people are still trying to do this today. Franz Boas, who is commonly seen as the father of North American anthropology, US anthropology, was an immigrant from Germany, a Jewish immigrant from Germany to the United States. And he did a study of the immigrant populations that were coming into Ellis Island at the time, people from Italy, Eastern Europe. He measured their skulls, bodies, and other things. And what he found was amazing. He found that in one generation, even if there was no intermarriage between these new immigrants, if they were only marrying their own people, that the environmental conditions of change in food and diet and health, and in some cases lack of health if you lived in certain parts of New York City in the tenements at the time, would change even your skull shape over 1 or 2 generations. Again, the idea that your skull, even your skull, was fixed through all time was disproven. There is no essential human skull. Now, certainly people have different head sizes and head shapes, and those group up geographically, but they can also change over several generations. So what good is a racial classification that's going to change in 2 or 3 generations? When it comes to the position of anthropology and this idea of scientific racism, which again I'm putting in quotes because it's not scientific, Franz Boas, your textbook also talks about W.E.B. Du Bois and W. Montague Cobb, some of the first Black or African American PhDs in this country, fought against the idea and had empirical evidence that biologically one race was inferior or superior to another. It led to this perhaps now common statement that you may have heard that race is a social construction. It is an idea we have about how people group into the world. But again, it does not describe well our actual physical or biological variation. So this is the position of anthropology, is that when it comes to race, it is a belief or an idea we have that has been used to organize the world, but it is part of social organization. It is not a very good grouping of our biology. Now, a lot of people are like, wait a second, I saw an anthropologist on TV and they held up a bone of somebody and they said, this is a white guy. How did they do that if race is a social construction? How do they know what the bones are? And it is true that forensic anthropologists or forensic osteologists can estimate what a person's race might have been based on their bones. How is that possible? So I want to talk about what someone is doing when they say this person was white or this person was black. So let me first say that there is no indication of skin color from bones. When you die, when anybody dies, and then they decay, and you get down to your bones, there's no way they can tell what your eye shape was, what your skin color was. Heck, a lot of the time it takes them a while to figure out whether you're biologically male or female. Because believe it or not, that pubic area in terms of the skeletal is not as clear cut as you might think. Variation there, and they've had to go back and reclassify a lot of skeletons that they thought were male, but they were like, I don't think so anymore. So when you're talking about bones, you're not going to get hair color, you're not going to get skin color, you're not going to get these facial features. Those are all based on reconstructions. So interestingly, a while back, a group of forensic anthropologists published an article in which they did an experiment to show what it is that you do when you make these declarations based on bones. They had a set of bones that they already did know were from Iowa. They found these bones in a creek in Iowa. They said, okay, we're going to take these bones and we're going to match them onto what their best fit would be in a world database. There are databases that have different sets of bones from different populations and give you an approximate fit. The first thing they did is they said, okay, we're going to blast these bones statistically against what we would find across the world. And they said, if we just did it statistically, the best match for these bones is from Easter Island. Easter Island and the big heads. There are not too many people from Easter Island. Maybe a few thousand, 10,000. How likely is it that the bones in Iowa were from a person who was from Easter Island? 0. Pretty close to 0. They said, okay, what we are going to do now is calculate what these bones would be like since we know that we found them in Iowa based on the population of the people who live in Iowa, which is 93% white. They said, given those probabilities, yes, these bones are probably white or are bones of somebody who would have been assigned white. Do you see what I'm saying? Because let me give you another. They said, well, what if we had found these bones in Gary, Indiana? Gary, Indiana has had its ups and downs. It is a factory town where many people work hard jobs in order to make a living. The population of Gary, Indiana is about 93% Black or African American. They ran the statistics and they said, if these bones were been found in Gary, Indiana, we would say that they were Black. Same bones. 2 different places, hypothetically locations. Then they said, what if we had found these bones in the state of Hawaii? They said, if we had found these bones there, we would say that they were of a person that was a Pacific Islander, which makes sense because originally they said, hey, these bones most closely match from somebody from Easter Island. The point of the matter is, once again, bones don't tell us color, skin color. They don't tell us eye shape. They don't tell us how gross that person was. What they tell us is an estimation of ancestry based on geography. What forensic anthropologists do when they say this is a bones of a white person is say these most closely match a person that probably would have been considered white or a person who might have been considered guess. So it's a probability guess. They can be very accurate because in most places, those are the percentages of populations. It's probably not a hard guess that in Iowa, 93% of the people are going to be white anyway, vice versa in Gary, Indiana. So, biologically speaking, race is a social construction. That is to say, it is an idea that we have about the world, and it's an idea that we have which we then use to assign words to people, like lazy, or gross, or stinky, serious, angry. Even if we know that race isn't biologically real, however, that doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect on the world. So as your textbook says, experiencing the effects of racism directly affects biology. So that is to say, the environment you grow up in, the health care you receive, the educational opportunities that you have been granted are certainly something that affects your pocketbook and your food intake and the kinds of things that you might do in life, but it also affects the way you biologically develop. Your textbook, which talks about how this happens in hospitals and why, for example, in the United States, the maternal infant mortality rate for Black mothers is often quite a bit more than for white mothers. Again, it has to do with nutrition, prenatal care, healthcare systems. There are places in this country where that prenatal mortality rate is the same. So it's not a biological thing. It can be addressed. But still, statistically over the country, and especially in certain places, it's really bad. It's like 3 times as worse for Black mothers. There are anthropologists who have tried to address this. We talked about in the health chapter of how to listen to people with different ailments and ways people might talk about things, and not to make assumptions about people based on their appearance. I mentioned the idea of tolerating pain. It is that common assumption among people and even among medical professionals that African Americans or Black people are able to better tolerate pain. And so they might underdiagnose pain medications. There was a great episode of The Pit during the first season, the ER trauma, where someone comes in and is experiencing sickle cell trait can be very painful if you are living with it. And it is often assumed that people that experience that pain are after strong drugs because you need very strong drugs to treat it. But it is not. It is not that they are wanting, well, obviously they do want strong drugs because they want to get rid of this pain, but we should not be reluctant to use that if people have sickle cell trait. This is something that happens, obviously, to this day. It can be addressed, but there are structural reasons why this happens. The latter part of this section 4.2, your textbook talks about racism and embodied stress. So being exposed to subtle and not so subtle forms of racism, having your home or your people called certain words, being called low IQ, high IQ, whatever. So this can happen at an individual level. It's often more important in the educational system, for example, the type of nutrition that you can get, the type of health care that you can get. There are increased rates of hypertension among African Americans, usually less sleep quality, which has a lot to do with many of our health issues. The last point about accelerated aging is a little bit more cutting edge. Probably need more research to do that, but it seems like some of the factors of racism contribute to, among certain groups, poor health outcomes, which then can reproduce in the next generation. Again, this is not to say that rich white people don't have hypertension. This is something that obviously is different groups have, or certain individuals among different populations might have accelerated aging based on their jobs and stress levels. But in our own society, it can often broadly correspond to the ways in which people have been racially categorized and then the places that they end up growing up in and living in and developing in.